This is a character profile of Immortan Joe, aka Colonel Joe Moore. So I'm gonna have to talk a little bit about the background of the character to kind of get a better feel from him. In the movie, he's kind of portrayed as being a psychopathic, evil warlord, and that's certainly true. Nothing I'm going to say about him. Don't get for a minute that Immortan Joe isn't a bad man. Immortan Joe's the bad guy, no question. But he's a little more complicated than maybe the movie necessarily portrays. So Colonel Joe Moore was an officer in the Australian Army. He was a veteran from the oil wars and a hero of the water wars. Now, we don't know exactly about that, but in the timeline of Mad Max, there was a global energy shortage followed by a nuclear exchange and a war over remaining water resources. Um, so he obviously participated in this and was one of the survivors. After the bombs fell and the world more or less collapsed, Immortan Joe took his military unit, together with his right-hand man, who named himself Major Kalishnikov, who's the bullet farmer in the movie. He's the one who wears the headdress made of shell casings as a signal of his wealth. And they took their old military unit and set out to build their own version of civilization, attempt to build a new world from the ashes of the old world. So I think it's important to keep in mind that he was a military officer, and he continues to more or less run his organization like a military officer. The fact that he's a colonel also means that he is educated and he has some understanding of history, mythology, and just all kinds of useful things to founding a new society. However, the fact that it's entirely military in nature, you have to understand oftentimes military leaders have a hard time managing civilian populations because they don't know how to react to the lack of discipline that civilians generally have. So, because they were better organized and equipped, they slaughtered the leaders of other gangs as they went off, taking their women, taking back, taking whatever members would join them, and taking their resources. So they increasingly grew to be one of the strongest gangs in Australia. Eventually, they decided to enter the wasteland um, to attempt to establish the beginnings of their new order. Out in the wasteland, Colonel Joe Moore spotted a group of Main Force patrol officers attacking a group of people. He sent out a party who found a survivor from the group who would later become the people eater, who is the guy with the fake nose, the nipple clips, and the massive deformed legs. The people eater is nonetheless extremely competent in a human calculator. Um, from the people eater, he learned about a series of a massive aquifer built into a series of natural stone pillars in the wasteland, which was on top of a hidden lake of fresh water that was uncontaminated. So they tried to bargain with its inhabitants to trade some of their captured women for water, but the offer was turned down, and his gang was attacked. Colonel Joe Moore sent out some of his men to look for water, but they found a derelict oil refinery and an abandoned lead mine. Um, the lead mine would later be given to his right-hand man, Major Kalishnikov, and become the bullet farm, producing weaponry for Joe's growing empire. The oil refinery would be given to the people eater due to his scientific knowledge, and would produce gasoline, become known as Gastown. Joe Moore, inspired by a Maratha general, decided to sneak into the citadel and take it over in a similar fashion. He strapped a rope to a wizard and climbed the wall. Um, let's see here. So he's able to pull himself up the wall in the middle of the night and opened up a gate while his forces attacked from below. This amazing feat made people believe that Joe was a god, and they called him the Immortal Man, aka Immortan Joe. Unfortunately, the perception of the world led people to believe that Immortan Joe was a god, which is what something that Joe encouraged. Because he was familiar with history and culture, he adopted a mishmash of things from the past, including Valhalla, various cults, etc., to build himself into a leader who had unquestionable spiritual and temporal authority. Um, more and more people began to pour into the citadel, and he continued to scour the land for resources. The citadel was used to distribute water and grow crops, and the other outposts provided much needed munitions and oil, meaning that Joe more or less had everything he needed to run his own society. So, um, so of the people who flocked to the Citadel, they basically kind of had a variety of people. The smarter and more educated ones were taken up, as were those capable of manual labor, becoming treadmill rats who power the lifts into it. War boys, who are physically capable men who serve as the main kind of military force of Immortan Joe, breeders to produce more healthy babies, and milk mothers who produce milk, since breast milk contains all the nutrients required to function and a number of other very healthy things. So it's kind of the drink of choice of the upper class. He found the healthiest women he could and called them the Five Wives. The Five Wives being the women that Immortan Joe intended to breed his heir with. Sorry if that got cut off. So Immortan Joe was worshipped. Now it's important to understand about Immortan Joe is, to a certain extent, some of his actions are justified. He's not really sure how much water remains in the aquifer, and if he just gave all the water that everyone could drink, it's quite possible he could deplete it faster than it could be rebuilt. Who knows how long the soil will remain functional at the Citadel? It's very possible that he won't be able to produce enough crops to feed everybody. His plan to create an heir is also important because if strong centralized government collapses, the brief kind of little bit of civilization that they managed to rebuild could easily collapse, which would be to the benefit of no one. So I think it's important to keep that all in mind. The problem is one of Joe's children is stupid but strong, and the other of Joe's children is brilliant but deformed. So he seeks to have a son who is basically not deformed and has decent intelligence, so that he can leave his legacy to him. And that's kind of the issue with Immortan Joe. He is an extremely brutal man, albeit in an extremely brutal world. And while I think he's unnecessarily cruel and you can't really justify his actions, in contrast to the raiders we've seen in other Mad Max movies, he seems somewhat more organized, and his actions are a lot more justifiable than someone like Lord Humongous or Toe Cutter in the previous films. I do think in his own way he does believe that he is going to rebuild society. He probably eventually plans to expand beyond the Citadel to capture more territories, get more resources, and eventually kind of rebuild Australia. He doesn't think that he's going to be able to do it himself, though, and that's why he wants to have a son and someone to carry on his legacy. Max ultimately kind of dethrones him and ends that ambition. It's stated in the comic that the Citadel continues to exist, however, they have to prevent the hordes of humanity from entering the Citadel itself, although they do provide them with some rations of water and food. So to a certain extent, Joe succeeded, and his legacy did live on. Even though he was completely and utterly despised by the people, ultimately he did rebuild one of the few bits of civilization that exist within the outback, and to a certain extent he is kind of a heroic figure who just went bad. I guess in a certain way you can almost see him as the opposite of Max. Max kind of went off completely by himself and sought solitude to deal with his grief. Joe surrounded himself by other people and used his talents to try and rebuild the world. Joe kind of seeking, I guess, collective salvation, and Max kind of seeking his individual salvation. Nevertheless, Joe, despite the fact I don't think he was explored quite as deeply as he should have been in the movie, is by far the most interesting villain in the Mad Max universe, and is certainly a character I think that needs a more fair shake than he gets, although I don't deny any of his evil, cruelty, etc. I hope you enjoyed the character profile of Immortan Joe. This is Argent. I'll talk to you later.